I grew up in North Pennsylvania in a small town called Wellsboro. It's surrounded by state game land. I don't live there anymore, but hunting season was a big deal there. Schools would even close on the first day of rifle season because half the town would be out in the woods. My dad got me into hunting when I was about 12, and by the time I was 23, I was going out alone regularly. This happened during the late archery season in November of 2021. I remember because there was already a light dusting of snow on the ground, which made it easier to track movement. I had permission to hunt a large piece of private land owned by an older guy my dad knew from work. The property was around 70 acres of thick woods with a small clearing and an old logging trail running through it. There was also an abandoned hunting cabin way back in the woods that nobody used anymore because the roof was starting to cave in. I had been there maybe 4 or 5 times before and never saw anyone else. That morning, I got there around 5:15 a.m. while it was still completely dark. I parked my truck where I always did near a rusted gate and walked in with my headlamp on. The woods were dead quiet. I remember having this weird feeling like I was being watched before I even got to the stand, but I just blamed it on being alone in the dark like always. I climbed into my tree stand about 20 feet up and waited for daylight. About an hour after sunrise, I noticed something that immediately bothered me. About 60 yards out, I saw another tree stand that had not been there before. I knew the property pretty well, and I was certain it had not been there the previous weekend. It was one of those cheap ladder stands, and it looked old and weathered, like it had been sitting somewhere for years, but I would have noticed it before. What bothered me more was that there were no footprints leading to it in the snow, except for one single trail of prints that went from deep in the woods straight to the base of the stand. I watched it for a while, thinking maybe someone else had permission to hunt there and just never mentioned it. Around 8 a.m., I saw movement near that stand. At first, thinking it was a deer, I was dead wrong when I saw it was a person standing behind a tree. He wasn't in camo. He was wearing a dirty gray hoodie and dark pants. He was still, and he was looking in my direction. I didn't know if he saw me at first, but then he slowly raised his arm and waved. I wouldn't say it was a friendly, smiley wave, more so a wave like he was just letting me know he saw me. I gave a small wave back, thinking maybe he was just another hunter who didn't have proper gear. After maybe a minute, he stepped behind the tree, and I expected him to walk away, but he didn't come out the other side. I waited and waited, but he never reappeared. I assumed he must have walked deeper into the woods, but I never heard footsteps. Around 10, I climbed down to stretch my legs and maybe still hunt a little. I walked toward where I saw him. When I got to the tree he had been standing behind, I saw that the snow around the tree was completely undisturbed except for my own tracks walking in. There were no tracks leading away, just the same single line of footprints I saw earlier leading toward the ladder stand. I followed those prints and they stopped right at the base of the stand. I looked up, expecting maybe he climbed it, but it was empty. The seat had a thin layer of snow on it that didn't look disturbed. That made no sense. I remember feeling my chest get tight, like something was very wrong. I decided to head back toward my own stand. On the way back, I noticed something tied to a branch at about eye level. It was a strip of orange hunting vest material tied in a knot. I was thinking maybe someone marked a trail. But then I saw another one about 15 feet away, and then another. They were tied at different heights, like someone had been marking something pretty specifically. That was the first time I considered just leaving. Around noon, I went back to my truck to eat and warm up. Nothing happened during that time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line. I almost left, but I convinced myself I was just overthinking things. I went back in around 2 p.m. to sit until dark. This is where things got bad. About an hour before sunset, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps behind me in the leaves. Too heavy and spaced out to be an animal. I turned to face them, expecting to see another hunter. About 30 yards behind my stand, I saw the same guy from earlier. This time he was closer, and I could see his face better. His beard looked patchy and dirty, and his skin looked pale like he hadn't been outside in daylight in weeks. What really bothered me was that he was smiling, but not in a normal way. He was just barely showing his teeth. He was holding something in his right hand, which at first I thought was a stick, until seeing the little yellow and black handle. It was a screwdriver. He didn't say anything. He chose to just stare me down with that half smile. I asked if he had permission to be on the property, but he didn't answer. After maybe 10 seconds of this heart-pounding stare-off, he slowly turned and walked away into the trees. That should have been the moment I left. However, I made the stupid decision to stay until shooting light ended. Right after sunset, I climbed down and started walking back fast. In that moment, I remember regretting not leaving while I still had some light in the sky. About halfway to my truck, I started noticing the orange cloth strips again, but this time they weren't just on branches. Some were tied to small sticks pushed into the ground, but the thing that genuinely scared me was one of the sticks had something hanging from it. It was a dead squirrel. It had been hung by a wire through its back legs. I may be a hunter, but I don't condone needless suffering of animals. Under the squirrel and stick, in the snow, someone had drawn a rough circle with a boot. That was the second time I seriously considered running. As I kept walking, I started noticing more of them. Not just squirrels, a rabbit, a crow, all hung the same way like markers, or maybe a threat. I started walking faster. About 100 yards from my truck, I saw something leaning against a tree that made me stop completely. It was my backpack, the one I had left in my tree stand earlier that day. I never brought it back down with me. It was zipped open, and my stuff was laid out in the snow, including my knife, my flashlight, and my extra arrows. They were all lined up neatly, like someone had taken inventory. That was the moment of realization that someone had been close enough to my stand to climb it without me knowing. I grabbed my stuff fast and jogged the rest of the way. When I got to the clearing where my truck was, I had another unexpected encounter. It was like it just didn't stop. My driver's side door was open. I know I locked it because I always do. Nothing inside looked stolen, but my registration papers were sitting on the passenger seat instead of the glove box. I got in and locked the doors, and as I started the truck, I looked in the mirror toward the tree line. There he was, standing just inside the woods, maybe 40 yards away, the guy in the hoodie. From what I could tell, he was still smiling. This time he raised his hand again, but instead of waving, he just pointed at me. Then he slowly dragged his finger across his own throat. I left so fast I spun gravel all the way back to the main road. I told the property owner what happened, and he said nobody else had permission to be there. He contacted the game commission. About 2 weeks later, he called my dad and said officers found a makeshift shelter deep on the property made from tarps and old wood. Inside, they found animal bones and stolen hunting gear from other properties. I never hunted there again. I don't hunt alone anymore either. Definitely not in grounds I'm not familiar with. Anything can happen when you're all alone out there, yet not actually alone. This story takes place in November of last year when I was on a hunting trip with my grandpa to Crockett, Texas. I don't really get to see my grandpa that often because he owns his own company, so when he told me he wanted to go hunting, I was more than happy to go. I will say, I personally don't like hunting, but I love to camp, and I had never been to this particular lease he was taking us to, so I figured why not? I love exploring new places. So I took a few days off from work and went down to Crockett with him. As we pulled up to the gate, I noticed there wasn't a real entryway like most places I've been to. It was just a dirt track with an iron gate on the side of a freeway. My grandpa got out of the truck to lift the gate, and then we headed down a long dirt road through the woods until we reached a clearing with an old house in the middle. While we were heading toward the house, he told me his father built it and they used it to go hunting or just relax and take a break from life. I could definitely see that. It was so peaceful inside the woods I could barely hear the cars from the freeway. It seemed like the perfect getaway for the weekend, or so I thought. After we pulled into the driveway, we unpacked the truck and cooked dinner for the night. Everything seemed normal. There were old beds where we put sheets and blankets, an old TV with a VCR, and the stove was particularly old-fashioned as well. After we finished eating, we went to sleep around 8:30 so we could wake up just before dawn to go to one of the blinds. As I started to fall asleep, I heard a scratching noise coming from one of the windows with the screen on it. I didn't think anything of it and fell asleep fairly soon after that. The next morning, my grandpa woke me up to get dressed so we could go to the blind. After we got there, we settled in and surveyed the clearing. We didn't see anything for a couple hours, so we decided to take a nap. I woke up after only being asleep a few minutes and took my binoculars to look at the tree line. The tree line was about 1.5 miles from the blind. I swear to God, I spotted someone peeking around the trees right at the edge of the woods, like they knew we were there. It was almost as if they had been watching us the whole time. I was thoroughly convinced someone was watching us, so I woke up my grandpa. He looked through his binoculars, and right then, a herd of deer came out into the clearing. He just chuckled and told me there was nothing to worry about and that it was just wildlife. I was irritated to say the least. I know what I saw, and it looked like someone, or at least something. After about 30 minutes, he shot one of the deer, and we took it back to the house to clean it and start skinning it. After we gutted the deer, it was about 3 o'clock, and we decided what we wanted for dinner, but we needed to head into town to get some supplies. So we hung the deer up and left for the store. When we got back, we saw claw and bite marks all over the animal's body. My grandpa and I just looked at each other in shock. He looked at me and said we were going on a night hunt. I asked him what for, and he told me he thought it was coyotes, but I didn't think that was the case. This didn't seem normal. After we ate, we grabbed some flashlights and our ARs and went out scouting. We were talking for a solid 45 minutes before we heard anything. We got really close to the tree line, and I suddenly turned and saw something peeking out at us again. The second it realized I noticed it quickly hid. I tried everything in my power not to yell for my grandpa, so I did a light whistle to him and waved him over to where I saw it. He whispered for me to stay put and watch his back. He walked into the woods with his gun raised and disappeared. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting to hear something. After about 10 minutes, I heard a gunshot. I ran into the woods and saw a coyote with a mutilated deer next to it. I breathed a sigh of relief seeing my grandpa okay, but he told me the coyote noticed him and looked like it was about to attack, so he had no choice. We sat there for a moment before we heard rustling in the distance, followed by the most horrifying scream I've ever heard. It wasn't human, and it was definitely not any animal I recognized, but I didn't care to find out. We booked it back to the house as fast as we could while hearing intense heavy footsteps and heavy breathing coming from behind us. It felt like we would never make it back, but we did. We slammed the door shut and locked every entrance. All we heard were weird screeching sounds and breathing right outside the door. Whatever it was began to get frustrated and slammed against the door a couple times. My grandpa got tired of being scared and shot through the door a couple times. It must have heard whatever was on the other side, because it made that terrifying screech again and then ran away. As soon as we could catch our breath, I called the police and told them what happened. They were obviously skeptical of the story, but when the deputy arrived, he didn't know what to think either. We showed him everything we found. He seemed pretty unsettled by it too. Nothing ever came back from that call, but needless to say, we probably won't ever be going back to that house again. Kyle had been asking Connor and I for 2 years to go hunting with him, and we always brushed it off because neither of us really knew what we were doing, and hunting was never something I was interested in. Kyle was the kind of guy who actually knew how to do things though. He knew how to gut a deer, split wood, start a fire without lighter fluid, and somehow look comfortable sleeping on the ground. Connor and I were not those kinds of guys. We liked the idea of a hunting trip more than the reality of it. Sitting around drinking in the mountains for a weekend sounded good. Hiking miles into the woods, waking up before sunrise, and killing an animal did not. But Kyle finally talked us into it late one November. He said rifle season was open and the weather would be cold enough to keep the bugs down. He knew a spot in the mountains where he had hunted before and almost never saw anyone else. I'm being honest, he mainly convinced us with the food and beer part in the middle of the mountains. The plan was this. We would drive up Friday morning, hike in, set up camp, and spend the weekend hunting. I'm not a hunter, so I'll do my best to use hunting terms and whatever. Connor agreed to the trip because he would agree to almost anything if it sounded like a good story later. I agreed because I didn't want to be the only one still saying no, and FOMO is strong with me sometimes. We loaded Kyle's truck before sunrise and drove a few hours into the mountains. Kyle kept talking us through everything like we were in some beginner class. He showed us how to keep the rifles pointed safe, how to walk without making as much noise, what deer sign looked like, and how to spot little trails through thick woods that I never would have noticed on my own. After parking the truck at a pull-off near an old logging road, we hiked in for an annoying amount of time. Kyle said it was only a few miles. It felt like 10. By the time we got to the area he wanted, my shoulders were sore and my legs were shaking on the steeper parts. We found a flat spot near a small creek and set up camp there. Kyle did most of the work because Connor and I were honestly useless. By the time it got dark, we had the tents up, a fire going, and a little ring of logs pulled around it to sit on. That first night actually felt perfect for a while. The woods were dead quiet except for the fire popping and the creek moving over the rocks. We were drinking beers, talking about old high school stuff, and making fun of how bad Connor was at putting up a tent. It was a rare, honestly amazing moment. I remember thinking I understood why people liked this. Then, out of the blue, we heard a scream somewhere deep in the woods. We all stopped talking at once. Kyle tilted his head and listened like a dog, while Connor laughed a little and said it sounded like a woman getting murdered. Kyle said it could be a fox. He said foxes can make sounds that sound like a screaming woman. I wanted the fox thing to be true, because that scream didn't sound like a fox to me. Because it was so far away, it was easy to tell ourselves it was an animal. After about a minute or two, we started talking again, though not as relaxed as before. Every one of us kept pausing to listen, even Kyle. About 5 minutes later, the scream came again. However, this time, it was so much closer that the conversation died instantly. It sounded like it came from maybe a football field away, if that. It was loud enough that there was no joking around after that one. It sounded exactly like a woman screaming. One long scream that ended all at once. Connor stood up and stared into the dark beyond the firelight. Kyle got to his feet too. Then Connor called out, asking if someone needed help out there. I said that was a stupid thing to do, and then we all just stared into the woods and listened for an answer. Nothing came back. Kyle looked uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen yet. He said if it was a person, they probably would have answered. Then he said we needed to kill the fire and get into the tents. He didn't say why, but it was obvious. The fire was basically a marker showing exactly where we were. We put the fire out fast and climbed into our tents with our rifles nearby. I barely slept that night. Every little noise my brain picked up on. At some point, I must have passed out anyway, because when I woke up, it was gray outside and cold enough that I didn't want to leave the sleeping bag. But when the urge to pee got too bad, I finally stepped out of the tent. Right away though, I noticed our chairs were tipped over, and one of the coolers had been turned sideways. A grocery bag with snacks in it was torn open and dragged a few feet. Kyle's backpack was lying near the fire ring when it had definitely been against a tree when we went to bed. I called for Kyle and Connor, and they both came out half awake. Kyle looked around and immediately said a bear had probably come through. That made sense. It was the easiest explanation. We hadn't hung everything properly, and there had been food smells all over camp. The weird thing was that not much was actually gone. Stuff was moved around more than it was eaten or stolen. Still, Kyle sounded confident, and I wanted a normal explanation badly enough to accept it. He said we should move camp deeper into the woods, both because of the bear and because he wanted to get closer to the area he planned to hunt that day. So we packed up and moved. The second site was farther from the creek and on a thicker patch of woods along a slope. It somehow felt a lot more isolated, even though it probably wasn't that much farther in. We hunted most of that day. Kyle split us up, but kept us within sight at first, showing us where to sit and how to watch the tree lines and openings. Connor treated the whole thing like a game at first, but by mid-afternoon, even he had settled down. There's something about sitting in the woods for hours with a rifle that changes your mood, whether you want it to or not. Late in the day, Kyle shot a deer. It happened fast. I only heard the crack of the rifle and then Kyle yelling for us. When Connor and I got to him, the deer was down in a patch of brush about 40 yards away. It was a decent-sized buck. Seeing a dead deer up close was different than seeing one in a photo. Kyle had us drag it back to camp, which was miserable work. Once we got there, he started field dressing it and then showed us how to skin and break it down. Connor acted interested, but I could tell he was forcing it. I just felt sick. The smell was awful, and the whole thing felt brutal. Side note, I grew up an animal lover because of my parents, so the idea of me going on a hunting trip was already kinda crazy. Kyle was in his element though. He explained every part of it like he was teaching a class, and by the end, there were chunks of meat bagged in the cooler and a bloody mess off to the side that I tried not to look at. That night, we drank again, partly to celebrate, and partly because I think Connor and I needed it after helping with the deer. Kyle cut off some backstrap and cooked it over the fire. That wasn't our originally planned dinner. It was just a celebratory meal, if you'd call it that. I have to admit, it tasted good. As a surprisingly good day was coming to a fun close, the scream came back. It was distant at first, maybe even farther than that first scream the night before, but the second I heard it, I felt an uncomfortable feeling inside me. Like, this again? We all knew that sound now. Nobody said fox this time. Nobody laughed. Kyle stared off into the dark. Connor muttered that there was no way this was happening again. We waited and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few minutes later, the scream came again, much closer, and this time it sounded like it was moving toward us the way it had the first night. It was fully dark by then, and the firelight made everything beyond it look even blacker. I remember the feeling that whoever was making that sound could probably see us perfectly, even though we couldn't see anything at all past the trees, and that made me uncomfortable. Kyle stood up and grabbed his rifle. He was trying to act calm, but I could hear it in his voice that he cursed under his breath. Then, in this weird burst of drunk confidence, he raised the rifle and fired a few rounds into the air. Right after that, he started yelling into the woods like a maniac, trying to sound bigger and crazier than whoever was out there. Connor and I laughed, mostly because it was sudden and ridiculous, and I think because all three of us had been drinking enough that our nerves were mixed with stupid energy. But the laughter didn't last, because a moment later, the scream came again, even closer. Close enough that it sounded like it was just a few yards outside of the edge of camp, somewhere beyond the trees where the firelight stopped. Kyle stopped yelling right away. None of us said it, but I think we all realized that if it was a person, the warning shots had not scared them off. We put the fire out again, faster than the night before. Within seconds, the site was pitch black. The only light left was a weak little glow from the coals and some moonlight through the trees. We got into our tents with our rifles. I lay there wide awake, of course. I could hear little sounds from the woods, branches shifting and leaves crunching, but I couldn't tell what was real and what my mind was inventing. Then I heard footsteps, not walking, but running, fast and hard around the tents and through the campsite. Something brushed the side of my tent, like a dragging scratch, like someone running an object along the fabric as they moved past. I didn't call out for Connor or Kyle because I was terrified that it wasn't them. All I'd be doing was getting the attention of whoever was out there. Then it went completely still for the last time. That silence was the worst part. Maybe a full minute passed before that scream exploded right in the middle of the campsite. It was so loud that it didn't sound human anymore in a normal sense. I heard Connor scream from his tent. I yelled too without meaning to. Then Kyle fired a shot through the roof of his tent into the air. The blast was deafening. Right after it, I heard fast footsteps tearing off through the woods. All these sounds were so amplified, it felt like so much was going on. The footsteps got farther and farther away until I couldn't hear a thing. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Kyle shouted, asking if we were okay. Connor answered immediately in the shaky voice I had never heard from him before. I answered too. Kyle said we were all getting into one tent and that there was no way we were staying in separate tents after that. We crawled into his tent because it was the biggest. The three of us sat there with rifles and flashlights, barely talking. At one point, Connor asked what the hell that was, and Kyle just said he didn't know flat out. Hours passed like that. Every so often, one of us would think we heard movement and everyone would go silent again. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off enough that we all drifted off at some point. When morning came, nothing looked as bad as I expected. A couple things were knocked over outside. One of the beer cans had been stepped on. A plastic tub had been moved a few feet, but nothing was stolen. We packed up at dawn without even discussing hunting again. Nobody wanted to stay another night. We hiked back the way we came, talking more as we got closer to the truck, probably because being in motion made us feel less trapped. By the time we were on the road again, some of the fear had turned into that weird laughter people have after something bad. Connor kept doing an impression of Kyle screaming into the woods and firing into the air, like one of the Tatooine warriors from Star Wars. Even Kyle laughed. We talked about whether we should call the sheriff and report it. In the end, we didn't. Kyle said if it was really someone needing help, They would have answered us either night when we yelled back. Connor said it was probably some lunatic messing with hunters. I said it was maybe a woman on drugs or someone trying to lure people into the dark. Both of our explanations were scary, and they felt like the easy assumptions. Truth be told, who the actual knows what the explanation could have been. I got home that night exhausted and thought I would sleep good, but I woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat from a dream. In the dream, I was back in the woods alone, and I could see a woman standing between the trees. She was covered in blood, and she was screaming for help, and the way she looked right at me gave me chills, even now. But I couldn't move toward her. I just stood there while she screamed and screamed until I woke up. I sat on the edge of my bed breathing hard, thinking about those 2 nights in the mountains, and wondering what that dream was about, if it was my brain telling me that I subconsciously felt guilty. What sticks with me most now is the possibility that somewhere in all of that, there really had been a person out there and we chose to hide from her. I still tell myself that if someone had truly needed help, they would have answered us. They would have come closer to the fire and said something. All 3 of us wonder if someone really needed help that night, or if something darker was going on.
When somebody goes hunting, they're normally right smack in the middle of a forest or the woods, completely devoid of other people. Seems like the perfect setting for a horror story, right? These 3 supposedly true stories will show you just what can go wrong while hunting. This first story was submitted to me in June by somebody named Robert Scherneman. His story takes place upstate New York, a place I'm familiar with. Here's his story. I've been a passionate hunter ever since my dad before me started taking me out on trips every Saturday, and I thought I would pass down the same tradition to my son. During the setting of this story, my son Peter was 10 years old. I figured that was a good age to introduce him to the world of hunting. I armed Peter and myself with Remington Model 798 sniper rifles, however I carried it until I found the spot where I usually find game. We could have used the deer hunting tower hidden deeper in the woods, but I figured that wouldn't be the best first-time experience. I handed him the gun when we were set up. I had already taught him the basics of firearms, so it wasn't like I was taking him out there with no experience. I chose to stay put the first time as it would be easier for him, and I figured I would move up to the more advanced methods of hunting in the future sessions. There was a lot of waiting, more waiting than usual in this certain spot. I could see Peter was getting bored, constantly yawning and sighing, and that disappointed me. I didn't want him to think this sport was that boring, so I packed up our stuff and told him we're moving. He seemed to perk up a bit with excitement, and that made me happy. As soon as we began walking, I heard footsteps. I put my arm in front of Peter silently and motioned for him to raise his gun. He did with excitement, until I spotted someone's head peer out from around a tree in the distance. I pushed the gun down immediately, a bit disappointed, but also relieved that Peter didn't shoot. I gave him a quick little apologetic wave, and with that, he disappeared back behind the tree out of sight. Was he another hunter? I couldn't tell, but from what I saw of him, even in the distance, there was something off-putting about his face. I couldn't put my finger on what it was at that moment. Seeing somebody this deep into the woods was rare and also strange, and this guy didn't exactly look like a hunter. So, as a safety precaution, I suppose, I steered Peter in the other direction. Still no sign of any deer. Peter asked me about the man, like who I thought he was, for example, as expected, and I just told him I didn't know, and I didn't think we should get closer. I didn't want to lie to him. A few minutes later, Peter started complaining that he was hungry. I was getting pretty hungry myself, so we stopped and unpacked our snacks. I was extremely disappointed that nothing had happened by now. While eating my sandwich, I heard footsteps again in the distance. Peter did too, as he immediately picked up his rifle and pointed it in that direction. I felt my heart drop when I could see the same man from before peering out from another tree at us. I lowered Peter's gun again, and I noticed he seemed a bit uncomfortable now, as was I. I told him to wait there while I began to walk over to the man, trying to emotionally prepare myself to confront him. About halfway over, I stopped and thought to myself, what the hell am I doing? My son is right over there. I turned around and hurried back to Peter, telling him it's time to go. If you had your son in the middle of the woods and you thought you were being stalked, odds are you would just want to get out of there too. We were not running, we were merely walking back to the road. I was mentally waiting for a twig snap or a leaf crunch from behind us, and when it happened, I nudged Peter to go along ahead. I angrily turned around and stormed towards the man, who was once again peering from behind a tree. I'd say when I got within 30 feet from the tree, he moved back behind the tree out of sight, and then I heard a thud, as if something were just dropped onto the ground. I had my gun loaded in my hand as I cautiously walked up to the tree. I didn't even say a word. I don't know why. All I did was slowly creep up to the tree, and when I got there, I felt as if everything around me had completely collapsed, or rather ceased to exist, and all that I could focus on was the head laying face first on the ground in front of me. No body, just head. I didn't even look up or around the tree to see who had dropped it there. I just full-on sprinted back to Peter and told him to run. We made it back home safely within 5 minutes, and I made 100% sure we weren't followed. However, I stayed up the whole night keeping watch for the sake of my family's safety. I found out the next day through my wife that there had been 2 disappearances of local hunters, and that's when I called the police and reported what I had experienced. I had to, of course, play it safe for a long time, at least a few months, before taking my son out again. What baffles me, though, is how this person managed to kill 2 hunters who obviously had to be armed with some kind of weapon. I have since resumed hunting with my son. The next story was submitted to me just a month ago by Nathan Zielinski, and it's more of a mix between a camping and a hunting story. Here it is. It was my first time hunting. I was 21, going with my friends Anthony, Christian, Tom, and his girlfriend Diana to some park in Colorado to go elk hunting. We brought 2 separate tents that were relatively large, sleeping bags, 2 days worth of food and drinks, and of course, guns. I couldn't even tell you the name of the gun Anthony handed me. It was just a basic looking hunting rifle. Honestly, I didn't know how I felt about the whole thing. Killing a living, breathing animal that has just as much of a will to live as me, merely for so-called fun, didn't seem cool to me. But it was like the 5th time Anthony offered, and I felt like I had to say yes. I decided I wouldn't shoot any animals about halfway through the car ride. Anthony pulled into a lot, we unpacked the car, and proceeded to hike about a mile into the woods before setting up camp. First thing after setting up camp, we all followed Anthony's lead as he proudly babbled on about hunting techniques. I wished I had someone to laugh about it with, but everyone else seemed serious about it as well. I tried busting Anthony's chops by asking him, "Wouldn't it be better to stop talking if you don't want to scare away any potential prey?" He got pissed. I could tell he took this really seriously, and from there on, I shut up. And by there on, I mean however long things were going normal, and that wasn't long. During our hunt, we ran into a rather strange group of people. 3 rather large, dirty men with long, sticky hair. They looked like they belonged to some kind of inbreeding house deep in the woods. They looked at us and sort of nodded their heads as if to say hello as we passed by them, one by one. We were officially freaked out. It might sound like something that would be laughable, but under the circumstances, it was horrifying. We were deep in the woods, far from the lot, which was, for the record, completely empty, and it may sound exaggerated, but these 3 looked like creepy lowlives who could be dangerous. Thankfully, though, they didn't follow us, which allowed for us to peacefully go on with our hunt. Anthony ended up killing a deer. We didn't find any elks. We dragged the deer all the way back to our campsite, and that was actually our dinner for the night. Anthony and Tom went through a disgusting, bloody process of skinning, and I'm pretty sure gutting the deer, but I didn't watch for more than a few seconds. Anthony made us venison burgers. He came prepared with the buns and everything. While I didn't particularly agree with the sport, I was impressed with Anthony. We went to sleep first thing at dark with the fire still going outside. I was having a really bad time trying to get comfortable in that sleeping bag. Anthony and Christian seemed to fall asleep quickly, while I, on the other hand, had to be rolling around for at least 2 hours. I've always had a hard time falling asleep in sleeping bags. I was actually about to get up and go outside to pee when I heard footsteps coming from outside the tent. I opened my mouth to call out Tom or Diana's name, but I realized, what if it wasn't them? I laid silently and listened. In an unexpected instant, the zipper to our tent got pulled down, and I threw my head down to the side and acted as if I were asleep. There was a short pause before the zipper got pulled back up. I waited until the pairs of footsteps moved away. They seemed to be moving to Tom and Diana's tent. Then I realized it must have been them, and they must have been checking if we were asleep so they could, mess around, I guess. So I decided to play a little joke on them. I gave it about 5 minutes before I unzipped the tent and began creeping over to their tent. Then I realized their zipper was still undone. That's strange, I thought to myself. I crept over expecting to scare the two lovebirds, but instead, when I got close enough, I saw two men inside of the tent doing something to Diana. At that moment, I screamed as loud as I could, mostly out of fear, but also to wake everyone up. Anthony and Christian stormed out from the tent with their rifles. When the two men fled from the tent, I realized something. They were the same two men we had seen earlier. Tom and Anthony fired rounds in their direction to scare them off. However, something even more horrifying happened after that. After they shot their rounds, we all looked around us completely horrified, as men in almost all directions who were previously hiding in bushes and behind trees were taking off in different directions. We tried waking up Tom and Diana, but they seemed to have been injected with some kind of tranquilizers by the men. We had no choice but to wait until they woke up, which took about maybe half an hour. Running back to the car in that pitch-black forest was one of the most horrifying moments of my life. We don't know who all those people were. They could have been part of some secluded inbreeding house for all we knew, or even some kind of cannibalistic family. We have no idea what they were planning on doing with Tom and Diana, but we're just happy we all got out of there safely. This last story was written by Jared the Sprinter, and he shares his night hunting experience. I was doing some night hog hunting in the woods near my backyard. I was hiding in the tower I had built about a decade ago. In case anyone's wondering, I of course had a night vision scope attachment. I guess I'm what you would consider a hardcore hunter. I don't want to bore you with the unnecessary story prolonging details, so I'll make this short. And I want everyone to know that though I agree this story sounds far-fetched and crazy, it is nothing but the truth. And I in a way actually consider myself lucky that I'll always have such a horrifying story to share. So, while I was sitting in the tower waiting for movement, it finally came. I took aim and found the source. But it wasn't at all a hog, or any kind of animal I was expecting. It was a person, a man wearing all black. Black sweatpants, black shoes, and a black hoodie with the hood over his head. But that wasn't the freakiest part. He was dragging a sack behind him. My heart started racing. I was pretty sure I was witnessing this guy trying to bury a body. I continued to watch him, but then he slowed down, and I swear to God, it looked as if he turned his head up to me. I ducked down under the wooden walls of the tower, shaking in my boots. Yes, I had a gun, but just the idea of using it against a person is horrifying. I lay low, praying to God that he hadn't seen me. It wouldn't make sense if he could, though. It's practically pitch black out here, or at least that was my logic. Seconds felt like an eternity as I waited for the footsteps in the leaves to move elsewhere, but I didn't hear any footsteps. All I heard was the sound of a foot hitting one of the wooden planks on the ladder of the tower. I felt the entire tower vibrate and shake as there were 2 more steps moving up the ladder. At this point, I was asking myself deep down, am I going to be able to shoot someone? But for some reason, whoever was down there decided not to climb all the way up, as I heard them jump back down to the forest ground and began dragging the sack away. I think I stayed frozen like a statue for at least 10 minutes before even peeking over the ledge again. The coast seemed clear. I had to get home and warn the police immediately. I hopped over the ledge and descended down the ladder. I turned on my pocket flashlight, which in hindsight was a stupid move considering the situation, and ran back in the direction of my house. I was only able to run for about 10 seconds or so when I heard the rapid, manic footsteps crunching the leaves from behind me. I took a look over my shoulder, and there he was, inches away from my face. I spun around and shot him in the shoulder. He stopped and screamed in agony, and I took that moment to finish my dash to my house. Again, in hindsight, I should have held him hostage somehow, but that doesn't even matter now. I called the police, who showed up within 15 minutes with a whole search squad, and I led them all into the woods to the exact location where I shot him. There was a faint yet noticeable blood trail spilled onto the leaves which led past the body bag, which the cops seized, and eventually right to the maniac, who was hiding under a log next to a tree. He was arrested and tried for the murder of Jin-Quen Sakanaki, a Japanese corner store owner. I don't know the full story behind it, but I do know I won't forget this one for the rest of my life, and I'll also be telling it for the rest of my life.
This is a story about the importance of truly knowing people. You may think you have a good read on someone, but in reality, you have no idea what they're thinking or what they're capable of. This happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago. The struggle of everyday life was starting to wear thin on me and my girlfriend Stacy. She suggested that we rent a cabin out in the woods just to escape for a few days. Naturally, I loved the idea, but I wasn't exactly rolling in the cash. So she floated another idea. My best friend Randy and his girlfriend were close to us, so she suggested that they come with us to make it like a couple's getaway. It would be fun hanging out, and they would be able to pay for half the trip. I loved the idea, and when I presented it to Randy, he was on board immediately. Since we were taking this trip in the middle of winter, we wanted a cabin with a fireplace and somewhere that would just give us that warm and cozy feeling. Stacy found a place, and we booked it for the end of that month. We were excited and started planning meals and other fun stuff to do at the cabin. Less than a week until the trip, Randy and his girlfriend broke up. The breakup was sudden and it didn't end well. Stacy and I tried to figure out if we should offer Randy his money back or just not say anything. We really didn't have the funds to do this alone, but it's also not fair to make Randy pay for half a trip that he's not even going on. I called Randy to talk about it, and he told me not to worry about it. I offered several times to give him his money back, but he insisted that we still go and have a romantic getaway. When I told Stacy the news, she was excited, and we started getting pumped for our trip alone. The next day, which was only a few days before the trip, Randy told me that he found someone else to go on the trip with us. I told him that I wasn't crazy about that idea, and when Stacy heard, she agreed. We didn't really want to travel with some random rebound that even Randy barely knew. I tried explaining to him that travel compatibility is a real thing, and that we know nothing about this woman. Randy begged, and after a few minutes, he talked me into it. He offered to pay for my entire portion of the trip, and he promised that his new girlfriend would be cool and that we would love her. Stacy and I were not happy. We knew the trip had the potential to end in awkward disaster. That alone would be a horror story. It took a little while, but we decided that we were going to make the best of this situation. The weekend finally arrived, and we carpooled to the cabin together in my truck. Randy introduced us to his new girlfriend, Lucy. She seemed sweet and even a little quiet. Stacy and I are not shy, and we can be loud and annoying. We spent most of the drive trying to get to know Lucy, but she wasn't very talkative. I barely knew what her voice sounded like by the time we got to the cabin. The trip started fine. We all got settled in, and we were just hanging around the fireplace chatting. Stacy and I love playing card games, but we especially love Uno. We just love its simplicity, and we could play it just about anywhere and any time. So Stacy suggested that we play Uno, and everyone was on board. Even Lucy seemed like she was finally starting to come out of her shell. During the Uno game, we witnessed our first red flag of the weekend. When Stacy called Uno, indicating that she only had one card left, Lucy looked over at her, and with rage and anger in her normally mousy voice, she started to rip into Stacy. We all kind of laughed at first, thinking she was kidding around, but that made it so much worse. Lucy started to go insane. She was screaming that Stacy must have been cheating, and there's no way she could have only had one card left. Stacy was defending herself, and Lucy just kept acting like a toddler and screaming about her cheating. I'm not being sarcastic when I say she was screaming about Uno with people she barely knew. Even if Stacy was cheating, which she wasn't, this was an outrageous overreaction. When Randy tried to calm her down, she threw all her cards and left the living room. He apologized to us, and we just laughed it off. Later that night, Stacy made dinner, and Lucy seemed completely fine now, almost like she didn't throw a temper tantrum a few hours ago. This is red flag number 2. While we were eating, Lucy started to overshare details about her and Randy's personal time together, things you don't say to others in public, like very private and personal things that I'm not going to mention in the story for Randy's sake. I could tell he was embarrassed. I just kept trying to crack jokes and change the subject. Eventually she stopped, and the 4 of us didn't do much for the rest of the evening. That night, Stacy woke me up in the middle of the night and told me to listen. I got up, and I could hear Lucy and Randy arguing. I couldn't fully understand what they were saying because the bedrooms were on opposite ends of the cabin, and we had our door closed. I could just tell by the tone of the arguing and inflection in the voices that they were clearly fighting. The awkwardness of this was crazy, and we didn't want to make Randy feel any worse, so we pretended that we didn't hear it, and we decided not to mention it the next day. The next morning and day were uneventful. Randy seemed distant, and we barely saw or heard from Lucy. It wasn't until that night that things got weird. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to Randy standing over me. It scared the hell out of me. I asked him what he was doing, and he looked terrified. He asked if he could stay in our room tonight and if we could keep the door locked. I was confused and asked him if he could explain why. Apparently, he woke up during the night and Lucy was standing at the bottom of the bed, just staring at him. When he asked what she was doing, she just shrugged and said that she was watching him sleep just in case, whatever that means. He said they stared at each other for a moment, and then she just turned and walked out of the room. Several minutes later, she still didn't return to the room. He decided to get up and go check on her and make sure she was okay, and that's when he noticed something on her side of the bed. He moved the blanket a little bit, and right there on the bed was a large knife. That's when he decided to sneak over to our room. He quietly walked through the dark cabin, trying not to make a noise. When he got to the living room, he heard Lucy humming to herself and wandering around like she was almost dancing. He said it kind of looked like she was sleepwalking, but worse. When she was almost at our bedroom door, the floor creaked subtly and she stopped humming. She turned to his general direction, and in an ominous voice, she said, "I see you." Randy said that it didn't even look like she was looking at him, just in his direction. After that, she turned around and continued to hum and skip around the dark cabin. That's when he entered our room and locked the door. I was trying to process all of this, and at the same time, Stacy woke up. We were in the middle of nowhere, so we didn't really know what to do. Lucy could have very well just been in some sort of elaborate sleepwalking state, but I don't know if that explains the knife. While we were contemplating, we could still hear Lucy pacing around the cabin. A few minutes later, we heard the front door to the cabin slam shut. We opened the bedroom door, and Lucy wasn't there. Randy looked out of the window and saw Lucy heading into the freezing cold forest with a t-shirt and a pair of shorts on. Randy ran to his bedroom and screamed because the knife was gone. Stacy said we had to go out and get her and couldn't just let her wander in the woods in the middle of the night, especially if she was sleepwalking. Randy was terrified and wanted nothing to do with his new girlfriend. Stacy went back to our room and started putting on warm clothes and a jacket. Randy was pleading with her to just call a park ranger or something. I've known Randy my entire life, and I've never seen him this scared. During our brief discussion in the bedroom, we heard the cabin door open and close again. We all got quiet and listened intently. We heard Lucy stomping down the hall toward her and Randy's bedroom. She was still humming. We stayed in our bedroom that night and didn't sleep at all. At 6 in the morning, we heard Lucy in the kitchen washing dishes. We all went out there, and she greeted us like nothing was wrong. Stacy and I chalked this all up to Lucy just being a bit off, and Randy going through some of his own issues since he had just broken up with his long-term girlfriend before this trip. Everything we experienced the night before was weird for sure, but it could be explained by sleepwalking or something like that. Randy was convinced that something darker was at play here, but Stacy dismissed it right away. She went to help Lucy clean, and I tried to console Randy the best I could before he went back to his bedroom. Not 2 minutes later, he texted me and told me to go to his bedroom right now and not to tell anyone. I went over there, and he showed me something horrifying. While he was packing up his stuff, he moved Lucy's bag. When he set her bag down, a large knife fell out of the side, the same knife that Randy saw the night before. I could see and feel how scared Randy was. He put the knife back in her bag and waited in the living room for everyone else to be ready to leave. The drive home was full of tension. Just knowing that Lucy had that knife in her bag freaked me out. Thankfully, we made it home safe and physically unharmed. Randy ghosted Lucy after that, and she must not have cared because she never tried to get a hold of him either. Occasionally, Stacy will still try to find Lucy on social media, but she's never had any luck. She's even looked at inmate lockup records and still no Lucy. It's like there's no record of Lucy existing, making us feel like she was clearly using a fake name. But if that's the case, what did she want? I wonder if she intended to hurt Randy. Truly, I have no idea what to think about that weekend. The fact that she had the knife and there's no record of this woman just makes me think whoever she was, she had dark intentions. I guess it's good that, for whatever reason, she didn't act on them. The last few years, I've really separated myself from the rest of the world. I've always been someone who likes to be alone, and I don't love the company of others except for some very few people in my life. A few years ago, I was at the height of my introverted personality. I would go out of my way to find peace and quiet. During this time of my life, I would often find cabins and other secluded places to stay on the weekends whenever I had the funds to make it happen. That may seem ridiculous to some people, but my anxiety for just normal interactions with people was so bad at this point that I would go to those extreme lengths just to be alone. This extreme habit continued for about 2 years. During that time, something happened at one of my weekend cabin getaways that really freaked me out. The weekend started like any other one. I found a secluded cabin about 2 hours from home and made the trek out there. I usually would use that weekend time to hike, spend time outdoors, and mostly just catch up on reading. I love to read, and being out in the wilderness where it's quiet always helps me to relax and concentrate. I arrived Friday evening at the cabin, made a small dinner, read a few chapters of my book, and went to bed early. The next morning, I decided to take a long hike. I've always just found peace being outside in nature. Whether it's sunny, rainy, or even snowing, I just love being outside. While I was hiking through the woods, I could hear something behind me. The sound of twigs and branches snapping. You could assume that it was just the sounds of nature, but it sounded almost too deliberate to be natural. I tend to be irrational, so my mind went right away to somebody following me. But every time I turned around and scanned the surroundings, I was completely alone. I kept hiking for a little while longer, but that feeling of paranoia just kept growing. I planned on hiking a little further, but I decided to cut the hike short and head back to the house. I had gotten to a point where I wasn't even enjoying being outside anymore. That night was particularly rough on me. Maybe it was because of all the anxiety I was feeling on the hike earlier, but I just remember being sad. I decided to have a drink, and that turned into a few drinks. Once I started to feel the drinks hitting my system, I felt better, and all that anxiety from earlier slowly disappeared. I tried to read, but instead, I just put on some music and started to vibe. Around 11 that night, I thought I heard a knock at the door. I turned the music off and made my way to the door. The front door was a heavy wooden door with 2 rectangular windows set into it. I looked outside and saw nothing, so I walked away, and before I could sit back down, I heard another knock at the door. I went back over to look out, and this time, someone was standing there, but it was too dark to make out any details. Before I said anything, I turned on the front light, which mostly illuminated the man standing out there. He didn't look scary or disheveled. It was the opposite of that. A clean-cut man with a suit was standing on the other side of the door. He was about 6 feet tall, had an athletic build, and was clean-shaven with a slicked-back haircut. This man was clearly out of place. He looked like he was ready for a business meeting, not a nighttime walk in the woods. I couldn't figure out why a man in a suit would randomly show up to a secluded cabin at 11 p.m. From my side of the door, I asked the man if he was okay and what he wanted. There was a weird and almost unnatural pause before the man answered. It was almost like he was processing what I was saying before he answered. Then he finally answered and said that he was driving with his girlfriend earlier. He claimed that he had spent hours walking around looking for her, and now he's lost. He asked if he could please come inside so he could call someone for help. On its own, this was alarming and unsettling, just because a random stranger appeared at the door in the middle of the woods. But one of the most unsettling parts of this was his lack of any emotion in his voice. This did not sound like a man who was lost and missing his girlfriend. He sounded completely void of emotion. I told him to back away from the door and wait at the end of the driveway, and that I would call someone for help. He paused again and looked around slowly. With that same lack of energy, he said that he really needed to come inside. Something was outside, and if he didn't get inside for help, he was going to be in trouble. The tension I felt at this moment is almost indescribable. I told him I was calling the police and that he could either wait outside or leave, but I was not letting him inside the cabin. As I walked away from the door to grab my phone, I heard him say that he wanted to hide inside the cabin. He was in trouble and he needed to hide inside. I grabbed my phone, and that's when he started to aggressively pound on the door. I ran back to the door, and I started to scream some vulgar things at the man outside. In the middle of my rant, I stopped yelling because I heard the man laughing. This was by far the most emotion the man had shown. I looked out the window, and the man had his face practically pressed up against it. His face was just inches away from mine. I nearly fell over from the shock of seeing him so close to me. In a calm voice, he said, "Come on, Victor, just open the door already." Somehow, this stranger in a suit knew my name. I was frozen for a few seconds, and then without thinking, I dialed 911 and I told them that I was staying at a cabin and a strange man was trying to break in. As soon as I hung up the phone, I looked out the window and nobody was there. For almost 15 minutes I waited for the police, and I never once stopped looking out the window. During that time, I didn't see any movement outside. It was one single patrol car, and when he got there, I opened the door and let him in quickly. I told the cop everything, and he seemed concerned and confused. He told me that none of the other surrounding residents reported anything weird, and this was the first time he had ever gotten a call like this. The cop was nice and could tell that I was a nervous wreck. He suggested that I drive into town and stay at one of the hotels if I was still scared. I told him that I had been drinking and that I didn't feel comfortable driving my car, but I didn't want to stay there alone. He was nice enough to offer to drive me into town. As we were walking to the patrol car, I heard the officer make a weird sound, almost like he was shocked. I asked what was wrong, and he pointed to the tires of my car in the driveway. My tires were deflated, and it looked like they had been slashed. I started to unravel a bit, and the cop did a good job of keeping me as grounded as I could be. He drove me to a nearby hotel and stayed with me in the lobby until I could get in touch with my dad. I stayed in that hotel that night, and my dad came to pick me up in the morning and helped me sort out the details of getting my car towed. The owner of the cabin reached out to me a million times to apologize, but I just didn't care. I wanted this experience to be over. I didn't even ask for a refund. Some people have floated the idea to me that somehow the owner of the cabin was involved in this nightmare, or that the owner himself was the man in the suit, but I don't think so. The man had a picture of himself on his profile, and the man in the suit looked nothing like this guy. I never got any answers, and I'm sure I never will. I still get chills to this day when I think about that night. Even seeing those stupid prism windows freaks me out. I hate knowing that somewhere out there, this man is potentially still terrorizing people. About 6 months ago, my father passed away. I'm not looking for any sympathy or anything like that. I didn't have a good relationship with the man. He wasn't a bad guy, he just didn't know how to be a proper father to me specifically. At a very young age, I realized that I was nothing like him. I knew I wasn't going to become the person he wanted me to be, and I know that bothered him, even if it was just subconscious. Fast forward to 6 months ago when my father passed, and I was surprised to see that he left me his cabin in his will. I've had friends tell me that this was my father playing one last joke on me, but I don't think that's the case. I think he knew I would sell it, and I think that's what he wanted me to do. After some of the boring paperwork details, I was told that, to sell it, I needed to go and clean it up and maybe fix some of the things that needed work. I used that as an excuse to stay at the cabin one last time. This was my way of saying goodbye to my father. When I arrived at the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the horrific smell. It smelled like death in there, and no, he didn't pass away in the cabin. He actually hadn't been to the cabin in almost a year before he died. I looked around for any dead animals, but I think the place just stunk from years of not being cleaned properly. The next thing I noticed after the smell was that the cabin looked exactly how I remembered it looking when I was 10. He still had the same setup, the same gross couches, the same bookshelves, Literally everything was the same. I spent a few hours downstairs deep cleaning every inch of that place. Luckily, my father fixed the roof a few years ago, so that was the one thing I didn't need to worry about. While I was going over my checklist of things I wanted and needed to do, I kept hearing noises coming from above me, like the sound of rustling and movement. That's when I remembered that he had an attic in this cabin. Attic might be a stretch. It's really like a mix of an attic and a crawl space, almost like it doesn't know exactly what it wants to be. There's a back hallway in the cabin, and located on the ceiling in the back hall is a pull-down cord. When you pull the cord, the door opens, and one of the retractable ladders comes down. I slowly started going up the ladder, and I was prepared to be attacked by a legion of raccoons or squirrels. Instead, I was attacked by an even more foul smell than before. I started to cough from the horrible smell in the attic. After my coughing spell, I looked around and was disgusted. There were boxes everywhere, but the worst part was that there was trash all over the place. Wrappers from food, empty beer cans, and just garbage everywhere. I knew my dad was not the cleanest person, but I also didn't think my dad was this messy and disgusting. I picked up some of the trash, but I only stayed up there for a little bit. The smell was horrible, and I was tired from cleaning downstairs. I wasn't mentally prepared to go through all the boxes and deal with the upstairs at that moment. I took out a bunch of trash and decided that I would clean upstairs tomorrow. Not long after, I went to bed. I put some of my clean sheets on his bed and slept in his old room. I woke up during the night because I thought I heard the sound of rustling again. I started to think that maybe the walls had some kind of animal infestation. That would explain why I kept hearing movement, and if animals were living in the walls, maybe animals were also dying in the walls, and that would explain the smell. The only problem with my theory was that the sounds I kept hearing were clearly coming from above my head in the attic. Since I wasn't sleeping very well, I decided to plug my nose and go check it out. When I got to the back hall, I noticed that the attic door latch was open and the ladder was hanging down. I thought that was weird, but totally possible that I didn't shut the door all the way, and maybe the wind or raccoons knocked it down. When I went to latch the door, I noticed another snack food wrapper on the ground at the base of the ladder. I couldn't believe there was more trash. I picked it up, stormed into the kitchen angrily, and threw the trash away. I grabbed a water bottle, went to the living room, and sat on the couch. It was dark in the living room, and I knew I wasn't going to fall asleep again, so I decided to stay awake. He had a small end table next to the couch with a little lamp on it. I turned on the lamp, and it wasn't very strong. It was a low orange light, but it was enough for right now. Just enough so I didn't have to sit in complete darkness. I started to think about my father. Then I started thinking about my father in this cabin. I was thinking to myself, why would he ever hang out in that nasty, dirty attic when he has the entire cabin to himself? Even though the cabin was disgusting, it was a lot nicer than a dirty attic. While I was sitting there, I looked over to the corner of the room, and I saw something weird. It looked like a blanket covering something next to the recliner. That alone wouldn't be weird. What was weird is that I cleaned that entire downstairs earlier, and I don't remember a blanket covering anything. I slowly got up and started to approach the blanket. I froze in my tracks. I was a couple feet away from the blanket, and I noticed something that looked like the bottom of a boot protruding from the blanket. I slowly took a step back and tried to focus my eyes in the mostly dark room. I was staring right at the blanket, and I watched the entire blanket shift. It was clear to me that someone was under this blanket. I wasn't hearing animals earlier. I was listening to the sound of a person moving around. I stood there for a second, just watching the blanket. The more I stared at it, the more I realized how obvious it was that a person was hiding there. I could clearly see the blanket moving up and down from whoever was breathing underneath the blanket. I didn't want to find anything else out about this person. I slowly retreated to the kitchen, grabbed my phone and keys, and sprinted out of the cabin. I ran to my car and started it, and started backing down the long driveway. While I was backing out, I looked up and saw a scary-looking, mangy man run out the door. He didn't chase my car or anything, he just ran outside and stood in front of the cabin. I called the local police department and reported this to them. They told me that because my father hadn't been living in the cabin for some time, some random person probably moved in there for warmth, and when nobody ever came to the cabin, he probably just stayed. Judging by the smell, he figured that the man was probably there for at least a year, which makes sense because my father hadn't been to the cabin in a while before he passed away. By the time the police showed up, the man was gone. I have no other information about who the man was, where he came from, or where he went. I don't think he intended to hurt me unless he had to. He clearly had a lot of chances and didn't do anything. But it doesn't change the fact that I was sitting next to a strange man who had been living in filth in my father's attic. I never took another step inside that cabin after that night. I hired someone to clean it out without even telling them. Maybe that makes me a jerk. They got rid of everything inside, and I sold it as is. I hope whoever owns the cabin now is as happy as my father was in that place, and that they never have to deal with a surprise visitor. Back before phones and social media took over the planet, we actually had to go outside as kids. Maybe it's just where I live, but I don't see kids riding their bikes around or playing ding-dong ditch or doing any of those late-night troublesome kid activities anymore. But when I was a kid, and I'm talking anywhere from 9 to 17 years old, I was always outside with friends. At my childhood home, there was a park down the block from me that some of my friends and I would use as a hangout spot, especially at night since our parents would get mad at us for being loud. The park was perfect because it had a small patch of woods on 3 sides, and then it faced the street on the 4th side, and across from the park was another small patch of woods. So basically, we didn't have any neighboring houses watching us or calling the cops on us for making too much noise when we were in the park. This happened when I was like 13, that age where we were riding bikes to get literally everywhere every day. I think that day in question was a Saturday, and we had ridden to a nearby pizza place a little earlier, then went back to my friend Tony's house, which was also not far from my house. The 6 of us were hanging out in his backyard until his mom came outside and yelled at him to either be quiet, send his friends home, or go hang out somewhere else. By this point, 3 of our other friends decided to go home. Me, Tony, and our friend Rob decided to go ride to the park instead of calling it a night. It was only about a 5-minute bike ride, and there was something so refreshing about riding bikes at night. It felt easier and more relaxing. So the 3 of us got to the park, and to describe the park besides its surroundings, the actual park had a small baseball field, a small bleacher stand, a couple typical park benches, and a pretty decently sized playground with a swing set. We would always chill on the actual playground because it was a cool, elevated hidden surface to just hang out on. At some point when we were chilling on the playground, Tony went, "Shh, did you hear that?" And we all stopped talking for a few moments to listen. When nothing happened, Tony explained that he thought he heard a footstep or some kind of thump on the playground that wasn't us. So naturally, we all kind of took a quick glance around the playground, and ultimately didn't see anyone. But probably a few minutes later, there was a sound that we all heard this time, and it did sound like some kind of thud emanating from somewhere on the physical playground itself. Now we were slightly unsettled, because we were almost certain someone else was there making that noise. So we took another peep, this time actually getting up and walking around, and even calling out asking who was there. Of course, there was no response. So eventually, we settled back down up on the playground. We bullshit for another few minutes until we heard yet another sound. This time it was a much more unsettling sound. It was the sound of a voice, a child's voice, and it came from inside the slide. One of those twirling metal slides you see at most typical playgrounds. I'm not gonna lie, when we all heard it, we genuinely freaked out. Even though yes, we did hear some weird sounds on the playground, we didn't hear anyone climbing into the slide, and the thumping sounds definitely didn't come from the slide. So naturally, I walked over to the slide and listened. Then I said, "Is someone in there?" And a voice said back, "Hello." It was a child's voice. I want to say a boy. They sounded like a toddler. I was 90% sure they said hello. My friends heard it too. We all gave each other these terrified looks. We had not heard anyone in the slide for the entire half hour we'd been there. I said down the slide, "Do you need help?" But there was no response now. In fact, we didn't hear the voice again. I had to assume there was a little kid stuck in there, so I climbed in and slid down. But as I slid down, expecting a child to appear around the corner the entire time, instead, I made it to the bottom only to find it was empty. I then did a scan around the ground level of the playgrounds and the surrounding area, and there was not a soul in sight. My friends were just as shocked as I was. There was literally not a soul besides us around, and I'm telling you, it was not possible for someone to have run away that quickly, especially not a young child. We checked every possible place to hide, and there was no one. We were already beyond freaked out, But when we heard the same voice once again come from the slide, this time saying, "Catch me," we all bolted for our bikes. We pedaled faster than we ever had back to my house down the block. We regrouped and caught our breath in my backyard. We were trying to be quiet though, since my dad was likely asleep already, and he would get mad if we were loud outside. So we sat amongst ourselves talking about what just happened, and any possible explanations. But things only got stranger when there was a knocking on the backyard gate. Yes, like someone was knocking as if asking permission to come in. I said, "Who is that?" thinking maybe it was a family member, but it was an unfamiliar woman's voice. She said hello, and then said, "Were you guys just at the park before?" We once again looked at each other in nervousness. There's a tiny crack in the gate where it met the fence that you could look through and see to the other side. So I peeked through it, and what I saw was a woman, middle-aged, standing on the other side, with this big, wide, creepy grin on her face, and she was already looking right at me through the crack, as if she knew to do so. I stepped away from the gate because it was such a disturbing sight. I backed away and said, "No, sorry." The woman replied back, "Are you sure?" And Tony replied for me, saying, "No, we weren't." The woman said, "Okay, thanks anyway." I stepped back toward the gate to see if she left, but she was still standing there, smiling and looking at me through the crack. We were so freaked out that we went inside my house through the back door. We quietly hung out downstairs for a while, completely shook. That woman was terrifying. Everything about her. My friends were scared to get their bikes and leave, so they slept over and left in the morning. We didn't go back to that park for a long time after that. If we really wanted to explain it all away, we could go with the explanation that there was a kid who ran away from his mother and was playing at the park, and the mother was looking for her child. But it doesn't make sense because we rode home so quickly that no one on foot would have been able to see where we went. Also, we know for a fact that we didn't see any kid running around the playground. So what the actual hell did we hear inside of that slide? Who was that? Who was the woman? At this point, it's a distant memory that will simply never be solved. I never thought a normal walk in the park could turn into one of the scariest nights of my life, but it did. I live in a small suburban town, the kind where everyone knows everyone else, and most people think it's safe to be outside at any time. It was a Friday night in the summer of 2018. I had just finished a late shift at work, and I wanted to clear my head before going home. The local park was only a few blocks away from the apartment, and I used it a lot to jog or just walk when I needed to think. That night, it was quiet, almost too quiet. The sun had set maybe an hour before, and the streetlights inside the park were on, but the main walking path still felt shadowed under the trees. I remember thinking how peaceful it was as I entered, the smell of freshly cut grass lingering in the air. I wasn't expecting anyone to be there. Most of the time on a weekday night, I'd be alone or maybe see a few people walking dogs or a couple of teenagers sitting on the benches. I had my headphones in, listening to music at a low volume, and I started walking along the main path. At first, everything was normal. I noticed a couple of dogs running in the distance, and some people walking slowly, laughing quietly. It felt calm, almost therapeutic, but then I started noticing little things that made me feel uneasy, though at the time I tried to brush them off. The first thing I noticed was a man sitting on a bench not far from the path. He was wearing a hoodie, the hood pulled up over his head even though it wasn't cold. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just sitting and staring straight ahead. I didn't think much of it at first. People sit on benches all the time, but as I passed, I realized he was looking at me. He didn't move when I walked by, didn't even shift his eyes from me. It made me uncomfortable, so I picked up my pace a little, telling myself he was probably harmless. I kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling, but then I heard footsteps behind me. I paused, and the footsteps stopped. I waited for a few seconds, then continued walking. They started again, matching my pace exactly. My heart started to beat faster, but I told myself it was probably just someone else taking their own walk. Still, the footsteps were too deliberate, too in sync with mine. I decided to take a different path, one that led through a smaller section of the park with fewer lights. The main path was still ahead, but I wanted to cut through a side trail that looped back toward the street. I figured I could get home faster that way and maybe avoid whoever was behind me. As I turned onto the trail, I noticed the man from the bench had stood up and was walking in the same direction. I thought maybe it was a coincidence, but something about the way he moved made me stop and stare. He wasn't jogging or taking a normal stroll. It was slow, almost like he was matching my pace without looking directly at me. I took out my phone and checked the time, then pretended to make a call, holding it up to my ear. The man didn't react. He didn't seem to care that I was looking at him. I forced myself to keep walking, trying not to panic. I thought maybe if I went faster, he'd eventually leave me alone. I broke into a light jog, and he did the same, keeping exactly the same distance behind me. My mind raced. Why was he following me? Was he dangerous? Should I run back the way I came? I made a decision to leave the park completely. There was a street exit just ahead that led back toward a well-lit neighborhood. I broke into a faster run, heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. The footsteps behind me sped up, matching mine perfectly. I didn't look back again. I just ran. When I reached the street, I slowed down and finally risked glancing behind me. The man had stopped at the edge of the park, standing at the shadows just inside the trees. I could see the hood over his head, the dark shape against the dimly lit path. He wasn't moving, just watching me. I don't know how long I stood there before I turned and ran home. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly unlock my apartment door. I thought that would be the end of it. I told myself it was probably just a creepy guy who liked to follow people, maybe harmless. I kept imagining rational explanations. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he was homeless. Maybe he just liked watching people walk. I tried to go back to my normal life, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. A few nights later, I was back at the same park, this time during the day, trying to convince myself it was safe. I walked along the same path I had walked that night, scanning the area for anything unusual. Everything looked normal, and I started to relax a little, but then I noticed the same bench where I had first seen him. It was empty now, but someone had scratched something into the wood. I couldn't make out exactly what it said. It looked like letters carved hastily, some of them smeared as if whoever did it didn't want it to be legible. My stomach turned. I snapped a picture and walked away quickly. After that, I tried to avoid the park at night completely. But the worst part wasn't that I felt unsafe. It was the feeling that someone knew I had been there, that someone was waiting, even when I wasn't looking. I started noticing small things in the neighborhood too. Shadows moving in the corner of my eye, a figure across the street that would vanish when I looked directly, a car parked down the block that I didn't recognize, lights turning on in houses when I walked past. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, that I was imagining things, but the memory of that night never left me. One evening, maybe 2 weeks later, I decided to go jogging again in the early evening, thinking it was safer than nighttime. I stayed on the main street, not going into the park at all. As I passed the edge of the park, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing just inside the tree line, barely visible. It was the same height and build as the man from before, and the hood was up again. I froze in place. He didn't move, but I had this overwhelming feeling that he had been there for hours, just watching. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, keeping my eyes on him. When I reached my car, I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove away, constantly glancing back in the rearview mirror. I never saw him again after that night. At least, not in the park. But sometimes when I walk through the neighborhood, or even near my apartment, I get that same feeling, that someone is watching me, just beyond my line of sight. I've checked the park security cameras in the past, and nothing unusual shows up. No one was captured entering the park at night, and the areas I walked are supposed to be covered by cameras. I don't know if he was someone who knew how to avoid them, or if it was someone who had been living there without anyone noticing. The strangest part is that I never heard anything directly from him. No voice, no movement besides the footsteps, just that presence. I've told friends and family, but most of them dismiss it as paranoia. I know what I experienced, and I can't explain it. I've learned to avoid that park completely at night, and even in the day I stay on the main streets, but the memory sticks with me. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring at the dark tree line where he stood, wondering if he's still there, waiting for someone else. I never go back, but a small, irrational part of me feels like he could still be there, even now, hiding just out of sight, watching anyone who dares to walk alone. I don't know why he picked me, or if it was random. I don't know if he was dangerous or just interested. All I know is that feeling of being followed, being watched without anyone seeing. It's something I'll never forget. Even writing this now, I feel a chill remembering the quiet way he moved, how he stayed just out of reach but always present. I still take my walks, but I make sure I'm never alone in the park after dark. And sometimes when I'm home, I swear I hear the sound of footsteps outside, far enough away to be unnoticed, but close enough to remind me that I'm being watched. I tell myself it's probably nothing. I hope it is, but I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, he's still waiting, watching and stalking me like he was that night. I never reported him to the police. There was no evidence or proof that anyone was there except me. I thought about it, but I couldn't even describe him clearly. Just a hoodie, a vague shape, and the feeling that he knew everything I was doing. The uncertainty is what haunts me the most. I have no idea who he was, why he was there, or if he's still around. Even walking past that park during the day now makes me tense. Even now, years later, if I'm driving past, I sometimes feel like I see a figure standing at the edge of the trees. I can't tell if it's real or just my imagination. I don't stop to find out. I just keep driving, hoping I never have to walk that path alone again. This event happened less than 24 hours ago. The details are still incredibly vivid in my head. I'm not even sure how to classify the story because it was so bizarre. It was the only time in my life that I've ever felt like I was actually in serious danger. Myself and a group of 5 friends were hanging out at a popular public park in my area called the Overlook because it had a great view of downtown and nearby universities. It was very late in the evening, around 11 o'clock. It was supposed to be just a chill rendezvous. We had no plans of doing anything other than hanging out on the park benches and talking. However, one of my friends said that he had Roman candles in his trunk and suggested that we light them off. The Overlook is probably the worst place in the entire park to light fireworks, so I suggested we go to a more secluded part of the park called the Loop. The Loop is just a few minutes away from the Overlook, and most of it is surrounded by trees, so only people within that part of the park would be able to see what we were doing. All 6 of us piled into 2 separate cars and made our way over to the Loop. Although there was plenty of street parking within the Loop, we decided to park outside on a nearby street just in case anything went wrong. We started walking toward the actual Loop part, which is basically a huge cul-de-sac surrounded by woods. The driveway to the Loop is very long and winding, cutting through a thick tree line. You can't see anything within the Loop from outside because of the trees. We noticed a few cars parked in different spots, but we thought nothing of it as people walk in this park frequently. Still, it was strange for such a late hour. As we walked deeper into the Loop, we noticed several cars parked around the cul-de-sac with their lights off. Suddenly, a truck behind us started moving, with its headlights off. It was facing the opposite direction toward the entrance of the Loop, but it quickly made a U-turn and headed in our direction. We all found this strange and hid behind some trees. The truck passed us slowly, then continued around the Loop, drove back toward the entrance, stopped suddenly, and made another U-turn. All of our stomachs sank. The truck was small, probably only fitting 3 people, yet there were 6 of us, all over 6 feet tall. Still, we were frightened and creeped out. For some reason, my friend thought that was the perfect time to light a Roman candle, and sparks flew in our direction. The truck immediately turned its headlights on and started slowly driving toward us. We ran further into the tree line, which was on a downward slope, and we hid behind more trees. However, the truck went over the curb and drove through the grass toward us. Whoever was driving must have seen us running, because they turned on their high beams and laid on the horn. We sprinted as fast as we could into the woods. These weren't paths people normally walked through. There were bushes and tall grass, making it difficult to move. About 20 feet into the woods, we began hearing voices from the truck and saw more pairs of headlights turn on from the Loop. During our sprint, we had become separated. I was with 2 friends and we didn't know where the other 3 were, but that wasn't our main concern. 2 men stepped out of the truck and sprinted down into the woods with flashlights. My friends and I lay flat on the ground, trying to stay hidden. I managed to squeeze under a large bush, but my other 2 friends were still partially exposed. We were in a sunken part of the woods, with part of the loop directly above us. It was quiet for a few minutes until we heard footsteps and saw flashlights from above. We didn't know if they could see us, but we were basically trapped. One group was searching from the front, and another was searching from above. We didn't understand why they were so upset about the fireworks. None of them had come near any of their vehicles, and fireworks are legal in our state. All we could do was hide and hope they didn't find us. After about 15 minutes, we saw the truck pull out of the grass and back onto the street, then drive away. The other headlights disappeared, but we never saw the men who had entered the woods come out. To make matters worse, one of my friends realized he had lost his phone somewhere in the woods while running. Finding it was surprisingly easy, but sneaking out of the woods and back onto the road leading to the loop was difficult. It was pitch black, and we couldn't use our flashlights or phones because we didn't want to alert the men of our location. We regrouped with one friend who had been hiding close by. He said one of the men had run right past him but didn't see him. However, he noticed the man was carrying what looked like a knife or some kind of melee weapon. After hearing this, we sprinted down the road toward the entrance. That's when we noticed the same truck from earlier, about 50 feet from the entrance. Fortunately, a dense patch of woods nearby allowed us to sneak into it and move toward the exit. Somehow, whoever was in the truck realized we started moving, because they immediately turned on their high beams and pulled the truck to the edge of the woods. At that point, we ran as fast as we could. The truck followed us along the road, but we quickly cut deeper into the woods. Eventually, we reached a main road that led out of the loop. The truck didn't follow beyond the entrance. We took 2 different back roads to get back to our cars to make sure we weren't being followed. We didn't hear from our other friends until a few hours later. They had managed to escape much quicker by running without hiding. I'm never going back to the loop. I don't know what those people wanted or why they made such an effort to hunt us in the woods, but I'm sure it wasn't good. It felt like an eternity at the time, and I've never been more scared in my life. I truly didn't know what was going to happen. During hunting season, at least once a year, I try to travel up to Maine and rent an Airbnb to go hunting. I never bought my own place because I can't really afford it just for a single trip every year, so doing a weekend rental makes more sense for me. Plus, I'm not exactly an expert. I'm still trying to get more experience. Some years I'd go with my uncle, but in recent years he hasn't been in the best shape health-wise and he's not really up to it anymore, so I've been going alone more recently. Last year, which was 2022 at the time I'm writing this, was the last season that I went hunting. It was November. The Airbnb I rented was near a national park. I arrived late on a Friday because I had to come home from work, get ready, then head out on the road trip. When I pulled up into the long stretch of private dirt road to get to the cabin-type Airbnb, it was pitch black outside, and it was dead silent too. This time of year there's obviously no bugs or crickets left, so the nights are dead silent and dark up there, especially if the place you're staying is secluded like this one. I pulled up as close as I could to the cabin, and the owner told me the key would be hidden under the mat. Sure enough, it was there. I brought my 2 bags inside the cabin and unpacked my things onto the bed in the 1 bedroom. It was a very cozy cabin, and the owner already had the heat turned up for me, which was nice. Maine gets pretty cold up there in November. There was cable and Wi-Fi in this Airbnb, so I set an alarm to get an early start at dawn, which in my opinion is the best time to find deer or even moose if you're lucky. The next morning, I was up as soon as my alarm went off, and I was out in the woods in less than half an hour. Since this was foreign territory to me, I posted up behind a blowdown I found, some knocked over trees. Usually this would now be a waiting game, but I heard a man's voice call from behind me. I had a mini heart attack and turned around to see some man with gray hair but who looked like he was only 50. He was approaching me slowly. He said slowly in a very angry sounding voice, "What the hell are you doing here?" I responded, "Excuse me?" He said, "Hunting is restricted here." I actually was unaware of this, and when I explained this to him, he said, "I watched you ride up here, you best leave the way you came." This scared me. I said, "What do you mean you watched me ride up here?" He told me he always sees people riding up to that cabin, always out of town folk who come up here for the wrong reasons. I apologized to him and told him I'd leave. I grabbed my things and started walking back the way I came, and when I looked behind me, the man was gone, out of sight. I walked back to the cabin, then took my car and drove to a different park that, according to some website, allowed hunting. I posted up there and had a failure of the first half of the day. Around midday, I went back to the cabin to just regroup and have a meal. But when I got back to the cabin, I found that the door was unlocked. I could have sworn I locked it before. When I got inside, I was almost positive certain things had been moved around and the zipper to my bag was unzipped. I couldn't remember if I left it zipped up or not, but it was typical for me to always keep my bag zipped up. I just checked every room quick before settling down. I was way too hungry to just prepare a light meal, so I drove to the little village nearby and picked up some Chinese takeout. Then I drove right back to the cabin. I was planning on heading back out to the park at dusk. When I got back to the cabin, I just ate my food and went straight to take a nap. After my nap, I headed back out to the park. I spent about an hour walking maybe a quarter mile very slowly, and I wasn't finding anything. My uncle always told me you could find a deer or moose in 10 minutes or 10 days. It just depends on how many are present and being in the right place at the right time. Sadly, luck was not on my side this day, and so when it was starting to get dark, I packed up and started heading back to my truck. It was just a short drive back to the cabin. I cooked the pasta and meatballs I brought with me for dinner as I had the TV on in the background. Then I laid down on the little love seat couch as I ate and watched some old black and white movie. While sitting there, I thought back to earlier how the door was unlocked and things appeared to have been moved. Only I didn't notice anything missing. I wondered if it was just in my head or not. Not long after this, I brushed my teeth and shifted to the bedroom where I began to watch another movie in there, planning on falling asleep to it. I was starting to drift into that half-sleep state where what was going on in the movie was actually starting to blend into this half-awake dream I was kind of having, until I heard the distinct sound of a door clicking open that snapped me out of my half-sleep. I groggily looked up and noticed the closet door in the room was now cracked open. This immediately woke me up completely. Now, the door being unlocked and belongings potentially being moved did not seem like a coincidence. I waited a moment, then got out of bed, went to my hunting pack, and grabbed my CZ75. I went back to the bedroom, turned on the light, and pointed my gun at the closet door. I yelled, "Come out now or I'll shoot." A big part of me still didn't believe there could actually be a person in there, and I thought that I was just being overly cautious. But when the door actually pushed open, I was in pure shock. That older man from earlier in the day stepped out, and his unhappy-looking face switched to a gross smile, missing a front tooth. He said, "You got me." I said don't move as I went to grab my cell phone and call 911. Thank God I had service here. The sheriff's department was on their way, and I let them know I was armed and had the intruder at gunpoint. It was an excruciatingly long wait before the sheriff's deputies arrived. During that time, the man was telling me how he's sick of people like me having no respect for the parks up here. I had no idea what he meant, but I wasn't entertaining him. I kept telling him to shut up. When deputies got there, it was an obvious arrest for breaking and entering and possibly robbery, though I don't think he ever actually stole anything from me. The man claimed the door was simply unlocked, though I don't know if that was true or if he had somehow picked the lock or even climbed through a window. The Airbnb host said that there were no other hidden keys and that I definitely left the door unlocked. He seemed more concerned about whether anything of his was stolen and putting blame on me as opposed to asking me if I was okay and apologizing for the experience. He said he had no idea who the man could have been, even after getting his name. I still don't think I left the door unlocked, but thank God I was on a hunting trip and had my firearms with me to quickly neutralize the threat. I was 14 when the story took place. It was my first year hunting deer with my family. To be specific, my father, my cousin, and myself. To paint a picture, my blind was 2 miles south of my father's, with his stand being 9 miles southwest to my camp. We drove a four-wheeler about 100 yards away from his stand, which left me with a while to walk before I even got to mine. I live in northern Michigan, and during the winter it gets dark quickly and early. It was around 4 p.m. when I started to get cold and decided to close up my tent. I was hunting with a .243 rifle that had a pink camo cover on it with a strap around so I could hang it off my back. I closed up my blind zippers and put my garbage away in a bucket I had. As I was throwing away my trash, I heard a couple leaves crumble, so I immediately turned my head up to see if it was a deer. After about a minute, I brushed it off as a squirrel or a bird. Disappointed, I closed my blind and headed to my father's. As I was taking my first steps out of my blind, I could see a fresh pathway brush through the leaves. It was a wide path, not from a small animal or even a deer. I immediately started thinking a bear or wolf, so I started speed walking to where my dad was. I started to panic as it started to get even darker and I was still roughly a mile away. I was just walking as I was stopped in my tracks by one of the most haunting and horrifying noises I'd ever heard. The best way to describe it was a bear/man that was being murdered. It sounded roughly 150 yards back as I started to run. Running with boots and thick hunting gear was hard with 20 pounds on my back, but fear pushed me through and I didn't stop. Around 25 seconds later, I was still running when I heard it again. This time it was louder and closer. At this point, it was completely dark out, with the moon being the only source of light. I turned around with my headlight, and what I saw is still the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Around 50 yards away, I saw a black figure in the dark, illuminated by the moonlight behind it. It was around 10 feet tall and skinny. Without thinking twice, I started running while trying to get my gun off my back. I didn't know where I was running, but I just ran. I ended up on a road that I recognized as Rabbit Road, the road that connects my camp with the entrance to the hunting area. I ran on the road until I got to my camp. By the time I got into sight of my cabin, I turned around again and saw it again, this time further away. It was still standing up, and I can only describe it as a tall, black, skinny figure. It had long arms and long legs. As I got on my cabin steps, I threw up from exhaustion and continued to vomit for about a minute, as I later then passed out. I woke up to the sound of my dad's four-wheeler turning into the cabin driveway. I started crying as I ran up to him, hugging him. I quickly told him the story of what happened and how I ran back without stopping. He didn't believe me at first, but as we got settled inside, his face started to change as he saw the desperation in my eyes. I didn't sleep that night, or for weeks after. People have told me it was most likely a bear or I was just seeing things, but I know what I saw. I'm older now, and I only hunt with someone with me. I also hunt with a bigger gun because it gives me reassurance that I could shoot something larger. As I'm writing this was the most scary experience of my life. It was a Friday evening and I was getting home from school. I was 13 years old and was really excited to go hunting. I love hunting, especially the ranch we go to in Alice, Texas. I've been going there since I was 4, and I have so many memories of the place. It was my grandpa, my dad, and I going. There were going to be a few other people, like the ranch owner's family. We were packed up and ready to go. It was deer season, my favorite season. Just the feeling of seeing a big deer right in front of your eyes is a wonderful feeling, and of course shooting it. People say that it's wrong to kill animals, but I disagree if you're actually eating it. We got to the ranch and it was 10 p.m., so it was pretty dark out there. The ranch is 300 acres, I believe, and the campsite is an old little shack, probably the size of a normal bedroom. There is electricity there, but it's not a huge cabin where most hunters sleep in. However, there are little beds there, but one time my dad found a huge snake shed in one of the beds when I was little, so from then on we sleep in a tent. The camp is surrounded by woods, with a little field up ahead, probably a little less than the size of a football field. We use that field for dove hunting. Anyhow, we unloaded and chatted for a while around the campfire, telling jokes and whatnot, when we heard this scream. It was the most disturbing thing I'd ever heard. It sounded like a human hybrid or something. The scream sounded not too far away. All of us jumped from our seats and looked at each other. Every man there was freaked out. I could see it in their eyes. The ranch owner was the first one to say, "What the fuck was that?" He then told us and one of his family members to go check it out. He's a pretty old guy in his 70s, so that's why we went to go check it out. We took my grandpa's ATV and did a quick search around the perimeter, only to find nothing. I was still traumatized, and I was even scared to go in the blind by myself. As all hunters know, we have to wake up before dawn and get up into the blind to be unseen by the deer. I went to sleep in the tent with a gun right beside me. I woke up to the alarm and got ready. I was scared of being left alone in the dark, even though it was only an hour or two before dawn breaks. I was still petrified by the scream, and it still echoed in my mind today. My grandpa dropped me off at the blind with his ATV and left. My dad was already in his position. My grandpa's not a soft grandpa. He expects you to know it and do it. Him being him, he just left me in the dark, expecting me to find my way up to the blind myself. So I began climbing up the ladder and began navigating with just my hands. I got into the blind and waited for the sun to peek out. 20 minutes passed and it was still dark out when I noticed something in the middle of the trail. I couldn't see well, so I thought it was the right time to use a night vision sight that my uncle had given me. I was excited, expecting a big deer, but when I put my eye into the sight, what I saw still haunts me today. I don't care if you believe me or not, but I was expecting a deer, only to find a person walking towards the woods. It was distorted looking, but had the same outline of a person. I don't know how it spotted me, but I saw it turn and face towards me. Now the night vision is not super clear, so I couldn't see its face, but I could see it was looking straight at me. Then, what I heard next will stick with me for the rest of my life. It gave out the same exact blood-curdling scream as the night before, only louder. At that moment, I cannot describe the fear I felt. The word fear is not enough to describe how I felt. I managed to break free from whatever shock I was in. I managed to grab the .22 and started to fire the entire clip into the path it was standing in. I was still frightened, so I got my rifle and fired all the rounds into the path. When I looked back into the night vision, it was gone. I started to get texts and calls like crazy, mostly from my dad. I told him what happened, and he had heard it too, and so did my grandpa. We still go there to hunt, but it has not been the same peaceful hunt. Now when I hunt, I go with my dad, because I'm scared that thing might come back. I don't know what that thing was, but whatever it was, it survived 25 rounds from a .22 and 4 rounds from a .243. Because when we went to go check, there were no signs of blood or anything, not even footprints. I know it was still dark when I fired all those rounds, but I know for sure at least one of them had to hit whatever that thing was. It was the fall of 1986. I was 23 years old. I'd never really been scared in the woods before, honestly. I always felt like the wilderness was my safe place, somewhere I could go and relax and get away from the stresses of life. I've never seen a Bigfoot or skinwalker or any kind of boogeyman in the woods. As a lineman for a small town in West Kentucky, I have seen crazy. Being a small muni, we all had to wear a lot of hats, including utility disconnects. It wasn't fun, but it was part of the job, and there was a lot of crazy, but never in the woods. My only real hobbies were hunting and fishing. Back then, it was easy to find a really good place to hunt just by stopping and asking the landowner for permission. Most were eager to have the deer population thinned out, as they were really destructive, eating young soybean crops. And this was coal country, and back in the 50s there was a lot of strip mining that left a lot of land unusable for building and farming, so much of it was open for hunting. It was October 1986. Daylight savings time hadn't happened yet, and it was still daylight till just after 7 p.m. I left work at 4 and ran home to change into my camo. It was bow season in Kentucky, my favorite season. I was gonna hunt in an area that was special to me. It was in an area we'll call Coon Ridge. This was a very remote area with broken farmland and wooded areas. After parking, I decided not to unload my three-wheeler and just walk the 3/4 of a mile to where I was going to hunt. I was using a Summit climbing stand, so I had to carry my stand and my bow, as well as my fanny pack with my knife and flashlight. I had to walk halfway around the cornfield. The corn had not been cut yet, so I stayed in the lane left by the farmers so that they could get their equipment to the upper end of the field. The field was rectangular, and the upper end was a much higher elevation than the bottom, where I had to cross a creek with shin-deep water to enter the field. At the top of the field, the right-hand corner was where I was going to enter the woods. It was the highest point of the field. I had to pick my way through a thick blackberry thicket, but managed to find a game trail that led me through, and it finally opened into a hillside with large trees. After finding a tree suitable for my climbing stand, getting set up, and a little climb, I was ready to hunt. I love to watch nature. The deer hunting was just an excuse to be in the woods. As a lineman, I had no fear of climbing high, so I would get as high as I could. This time I was up around 20 feet before the canopy started blocking my view. It was around 5:30 when I was settled in my stand and had an arrow nocked. I regularly stayed in my permanent stands late as not to spook deer close by. I had added reflective tape along the trail to mark the way out. This made it easier to find my permanent stands at night, but this day I was in my climbing stand in an area I hadn't been in at night. I was about to start down when I heard something walking, so I waited. It sounded like a deer in the thicket, but I never really could get a look at it. It was 8 o'clock and close to a full moon that night, so from my high vantage point, I could see pretty good in the woods, and I felt like I could still shoot up to 15 yards, but it was after shooting hours, so I started down. As I did, I could hear the loud crashing of a deer that must have spotted me moving like a sloth down the tree. On the ground, I quickly secured my stand and bow and looked in the direction of the way I came in. I turned on my flashlight. Now the woods look different at night in the dark, and downright foreign when you turn on your flashlight. It's not bad in a mature woods with no undergrowth, but I was walking into a thicket. I walked along the edge of the thicket for a while, trying to find the trail I came in on, but no luck. It was almost 9 o'clock now, and I was ready to get out, so I just started picking my way through the thicket, keeping the moon on my right shoulder, and finally I came out into the field about 25 yards from where I went in. As I stood there picking the thorns out of my hands and legs, thinking this adventure was over, I surveyed the lane around the field, and in the light of the pale moon, I saw it. Now when I walked in, I came up the left side of the field around 200 yards to the end, turned right, and walked another 100 yards, and where I was, it was higher on the ground, and I could see around the field where I came in. When I walked in, there was nothing in the trail. I hadn't heard any equipment or ATVs, so I was shocked to see something in the trail, and no small something either. It looked 6 feet wide and 6 feet tall, just standing there about halfway up the field trail. It was the only way out, so I never hesitated. I started walking back to the trail, turned toward whatever it was standing there, hoping it was just a strange shadow, but it wasn't. I grabbed an arrow from the quiver, remembering my knife was in my three-wheeler. I walked fast and never broke stride. 100 yards away, and it didn't move or make a sound. I walked loudly straight towards it for 200 yards, all the while thinking it's really there, in my trail, blocking my only way out. As I got closer, I could make out what it was. It was 2 people standing side by side, and this unnerved me even more. It was 9:15, 40 degrees out here. Nobody should be here. I kept walking, now 20 yards away, and I see that it's a guy and girl, maybe 20 years old. 10 yards away, I'm walking towards them, but no sounds from them. They just stood there. When I got to them, I half expected them to jump me, but they never moved. I said, "Kinda cold out here, ain't it?" No sound. They still never moved. I kept walking. I turned to keep an eye on them. I was thinking, okay, this is it. But they never turned around, never even moved their heads. I crossed the creek, and within another 100 yards, I made it back to my truck. I was even more uneasy approaching my truck. It was just so quiet. All I could think of was someone waiting to ambush me, so I kinda eased up on it very quietly and watched it for maybe 3 minutes before approaching it. It seemed fine, so I headed to my truck. As I left, I tried to figure out how they got here, because I never saw another vehicle. I tried to just put it behind me. But the next day at work, during lunch, I was gonna run and get some food, when I noticed all 4 of my tires on my truck were low, and after inspecting them, they all had around 10 to 15 roofing nails in them. I had to put tubes in them to get home. Something odd was going on in those woods. Somebody most certainly did this to my tires while I was parked in them. After this, it always felt like someone was watching me when I was hunting in that area. That's why I stopped going alone, and I never parked off the main gravel road again. I never found out who those 2 young people were, or who punctured my tires.